Welcome back to the podcast.
Yes.
Today, we're diving into a really juicy and exciting topic that we believe a lot of our own friends wrestle with. And it also hits close to home for the both of us.
Mm-hmm. I think
And
everyone wrestles with it to some degree without even realizing it.
yeah. And that topic is comparison. So we're not saying that we're perfect and we never ever compare ourselves to our peers or our role models or anything like that. We have personally struggled with it, but we've come a really long way from where we were before. I would say this is one of my biggest thorns on my side that I've come to overcome. To give a little backstory, I was constantly compared as a kid. My parents, being Vietnamese immigrants, and being an only child too for me, my parents really just were tiger parents. And I know a lot of listeners can probably relate. My dad always wanted me to get straight A's, eventually have a great career, make a lot of money, because I was also the only son. I had a lot of pressure just to perform and do things really well. And
Especially compared to the cousins.
oh, yes, especially to the cousins. So in my teens and even early 20s, out of college, I tend to compare myself to a lot of people. I was insecure and I was not confident in who I was. I was trying to blend in with the crowd a lot. For example, my dad wanted me to be an engineer, and in college, I decided to go against that and just do other things that I aligned with. I think there's a lot of ways that I've overcome this at the root. It involved a lot of therapy, a lot of counseling, a lot of life coaching. And right now, I feel a lot more confident in who I am and the gifts and abilities that God has given me, and even my unique story, that I'm able to live more into that, the life that God has given me.
Yeah. Yeah. And even just, we've been married 2.5 years, dated. It's only been like a handful of years I've known each other, but I've already seen, I was telling Alex, like I've seen him come such a long way, even compared to when I first met him, in terms of growing in his confidence and not comparing himself. And because I think for all of us, it's easy to get in our heads about comparing ourselves, but then people close to us are like, why are you comparing yourself? Like, you're awesome. Like, it's always clearer from the other person's perspective. But yeah, for me, I didn't have parents that compared me, thankfully, that much. Like, I don't really remember times when my mom would be like, oh, look at so-and-so, be like I actually think she was very intentionally like, be yourself, like, which is a good thing. But I think as most people experience, when you go to school, you have like peer pressure to conform. If you're not cool, like cool kids, you feel weird, you feel like you're an outcast, you feel like people are teasing you. Definitely had my experiences too of being teased or made fun of. To some degree, it's a survival mechanism too. Like, if you're thinking about people from the prehistoric times, of course, people have always needed to quote unquote compare themselves with other people to make sure they survive, right? Like, oh, those people have that kind of food. Like, where can I get that food to survive the storms in the winter time? So I think comparison by itself is not a bad thing in a lot of ways. It can help you survive. It can help you be wise and inspire you too, of like, oh, that person's doing this. Like, maybe I could consider that as well. But I think most of the time when we think of comparison, it's the negative effects of realizing it's stealing so much more than just joy. We know that everyone's heard that term, comparison is the thief of joy. We just wanted to do this episode because we were talking about that the enemy uses comparison as a way to steal not just joy, but also so much more that affects the rest of our lives. So yeah, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I'm okay, like I don't struggle with comparison, like that's awesome. But I would just challenge you, like we would invite you to consider, like, how could comparison maybe still be lurking in the shadows? Maybe you haven't even realized, because oftentimes we think if comparison is the thief of joy, and I have enough joy in my life, I'm pretty content and happy. Oftentimes, actually, we're like either escaping the discomfort and the pain, or we are numbing ourselves, and we don't even realize that there are gaps inside of us that we're trying to like compensate for, and it's tied with comparison.
I think also as Asian Americans, we tend to get compared to with a lot, especially those cousins and those friends. So I feel like this is a relevant topic just for Asian Americans and also Christians.
Yeah.
So besides joy, there's a few other things that the enemy uses comparison to steal from us. The first one is stealing your intimacy with God. And this one is a little more fresh for me. Grace and I were talking about how we love gathering in community and small groups and worshiping together. But I've come to notice about myself that I actually compare myself to other Christians oftentimes. Like, why is God working like that in their lives? Why are they experiencing God in this way? But then for me, I don't feel it, or I don't experience those miracles or manifestations that a lot of people experience. When I compare myself to that, I feel like I'm more seeking the experience rather than God himself. And I had a very busy week just with a team offsite, and I actually got to spend amazing quality time with God this morning, just listening to worship, singing, journaling, reading a bit, and just spending time in God's presence. And so when I don't compare and I just seek God, it just helps me connect more with God. And my relationship with God is just more rich.
You can't over-index on being alone your whole life or being in community to rely on other people to experience God, because oftentimes there is distracting things going on, or you're thinking about, at least for us, we've talked about sometimes when we're in large environments with other people, we're actually paying attention to, what do people think if I don't go to the front right now, or if I am not like expressive in my worship, let us know in the comments if you struggle with this or not. But for us, we're like, just honestly, sometimes it can be distracting. And for the both of us, like the most depth that we personally have experienced with God has almost always been our one-on-one times with God. The benefit of gathering a community is, of course, you get prayed over, you get prophecies, you get encouragement. There's so many things that are so beneficial from community. But when it comes to like really knowing God and hearing from him directly, for us personally, feel like we don't get distracted as nearly as much when we're just like spending time with God. There are probably people listening who are like, oh, I don't struggle with comparing myself at all in environments. And that's awesome. But I think for the rest of us, we have to consider, if I am getting distracted in corporate environments, am I balancing that with enough alone time with God to make sure I'm growing deep in him and not constantly like thinking about other people and letting other people's opinions drive you to shape your walk with Jesus, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I used to have a lot of FOMO about church gatherings, especially in my early 20s.
Yeah.
And I went to a Korean church, and this particular Korean church just had hangouts and events like every other day. The FOMO was real. I just went to a lot of things, and not bad things at all, like small group and worship nights and community events, all really good things and blessings. But I felt like it was taking away from my relationship with God. And ironically, and I had a hard time learning to hear his voice. I didn't quite recognize his voice, and it was slipping into a pretty unhealthy place. But as I grew older, my pendulum swung a little bit more towards my own personal relationship with God and my own secret place, as they say.
Yeah.
And so I would say my relationship with God now is so much richer than it was before, when I depended on events or gatherings. Again, not bad. We're a part of gatherings. We go to small groups and all that, but I think we need a balance of both, like Grace said.
Yeah. Another analogy that just came to mind is kind of, at least again, for us personally, I remember in college, and my experience was that whenever I would go to like recruiting events or networking events, to get an internship or a potential job, it's so stressful when you have to like line up, and then it ends up like a group of students all trying to talk over each other to talk to the recruiter.
I remember those business networking. We're
So
both like business
cringy.
majors.
Yeah. And it's like so cringy. You're like trying to pay attention to like what the recruiter's saying, but at the same time, you're kind of everyone's eyeing each other. Like, oh, that person seems so much more ahead of me. They would totally get the internship and I wouldn't, so everyone's kind of like eyeing each other, even if no one's saying it, versus I much prefer times when they had career fairs or networking events and you could one by one talk to the recruiter and not have that pressure of like, what is everyone saying right now? Or how's the recruiter responding to everybody else? Like, sometimes the recruiter would say certain comments to people that you're like, oh man, like they're their favorite. And again, not saying that God is a recruiter, but I think those dynamics can come to play sometimes. And it just really like fuels, like if you have weaknesses that like, oh yeah, I had childhood wounds of being compared or not feeling like I'm cool enough or good enough or pretty enough or whatever enough compared to other people, these kinds of environments, it's just good to be aware of that so that you're like, okay, how can I not shame myself for feeling that way, but make sure that I'm reminding myself this is not about other people or what they're experiencing. This is about me and God. And if I find this environment hard to do that, especially so, I need to make sure I'm having one-on-one time with God. That's kind of related to our second point of what comparison steals outside of just joy, which is like a feeling. Comparison steals really your internal self-worth because it makes you lose sight of your identity. Like when you're comparing yourself with other people, you're like, why am I not like them? Why am I not doing it this way? Why is my life not looking like this? And it really blinds you from who God made you to be. And at the core of who you are like God designed you to be his child that he loves. And the problem with comparison is that it makes us feel like we need to do certain things or be a certain way, or our life needs to look a certain way to be quote unquote enough, to have worth, especially with AI and like social media. AI can create some pretty crazy images now. Like you can't tell what's real or not, especially in the work like sector. Everyone's using AI to create all this cool looking stuff and videos and whatever, and creating content, coding. And so it's very easy to be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to like fall behind if I'm not catching up. I feel insecure. I feel like I am anxious about falling behind. And just to be honest, that's honestly what I have noticed coming up in myself these days has been, oh wow, other people are using all these AI tools that are really pricey. All of them have high subscription models to profit off of AI, of course. But at the same time, it's like reminding me, I don't need to rely on AI to be enough. Like I'm not going to rely on AI as a god to compare myself with other people being like, I need to be like them. I personally think that Jesus came in the form that he did as a very simple, humble person without much stuff. Like he was pretty minimalistic. I think he did that because he was showing a countercultural way of living. It's easy when we're scrolling on social media to be like, oh, wow, I wish I had that house or that vacation or that spouse, or not that spouse, but that kind of life, that family. And yeah, then it just steals from realizing who you are because you're so focused on who other people are. And I feel like Jesus came to model a way of simplicity to show that you don't need all the fancy things to be enough. Like God loves you just as you are without the stuff in your life that to prove your worth.
Typically, when people compare themselves to others, it's usually one fixed point in their lives. For a lot of us, it's career or money. And life is so complicated. It's complex.
Right.
Just because one person is exceeding in one point of their life, let's say career in this case, like logically speaking, does that mean that that person's life is better than yours, or they're winning at life more than you? Not really. What about their relationship with God, their friendships, their marriage, relationship with kids, their health? So many other factors out there that it's actually very illogical to compare yourself, because it honestly makes no logical sense, but we just fix our comparison on just like one data point in someone else's life compared to yours.
Right. You're logically telling yourself, oh yeah, I know I shouldn't compare. But as you're looking at other people's lives, your subconscious, like inner child self is like, oh, but I wish I was like that. And things would be better if I did have that. And the grass is greener on the other side. When the reality is the grass will fade wherever you are. The weather is going to change wherever you are. And so this point is more and more important for us and the next generations to come, because it's getting harder to resist the comparison, basically, with social media, AI generated stuff. Back in the old days, people didn't know what was going on in the world with other people. They only knew their small town. So with more information and exposure to how other people want to curate and present their lives, their highlight reels, it's getting increasingly difficult to stay rooted in our self-worth instead of being like, I need to have that or be like this in order to be good enough.
Yeah, I'm pretty convinced that if I sit down and talk with anyone, I'm sure I can find some problems in their life. No matter if they're billionaires, I'm sure if we go deep enough, there's something there that is not sitting well with them.
Right.
So anyways.
But at the same time, I feel like we shouldn't find comfort in other people's problems. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like, we're not saying imagine that person probably has like a sucky life, because it's more like perfection is an illusion. And if you think that that person has a perfect life, it's not realistic.
Good call out. So the third effect that comparison steals is your ability to genuinely root, love, and champion others. As the church, we're all on one team, like the Avengers, and we're all just working together for a common mission at a very high level. But when there's comparison, it breeds envy, jealousy, and insecurity. So I feel like comparison just divides us even more because we're not able to genuinely root for people. And it's just miserable too when you're stuck in that comparison mode. For me, this took a while to really break out of it. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I was compared to a lot by my cousin. He was more athletic and more musically talented than I was. He just had it all. That was better than me. And he was also younger than me, which did make my life feel good. So it was hard for me to see him succeed. And now I have come to a point where his success doesn't affect me that much and I can cheer him on even more. And when it comes to other people as well, I have more freedom to cheer them on. And I think it just came from a lot of counseling and just a lot of deep internal work that I myself had to work on, which we can dive deeper into probably a future episode. But it was a lot of healing and journeying with Jesus on healing the wounds that I was trying to heal and the deficits that I had. And now that I think about it, when you compare yourself to people, it's almost like you're looking for something to close that gap or that deficit in your life. You're trying to look down on them to make you feel better about yourself at the end of the day. And that's not healthy because there's going to be people of all spectrums who will be better. There's people who are better objectively and worse objectively.
Right. It's not a zero sum where like if they win, you lose. That's like a lie that we've been taught or conditioned with, like, oh, if that person's better, you need to be better too. Otherwise, you're losing. And that's like such an unhealthy, competitive, disunified mindset instead of like, how can I be happy for them and their abundance and their blessings and their success and know that their success is not a threat to me?
Yeah, definitely. Some key verses that I found to be helpful. Proverbs 14:30. It says, "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones."
Dang.
Wow. I do not want my bones to rot. Last one. This one spoke to me for a while. Ecclesiastes 4:4. It says, "And I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one another's envy of one another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." So basically, envy pollutes our hearts and our lives.
I think around middle school, I told my mom, like, I'm so annoyed by these people at school who keep bragging about, like, blatantly bragging about themselves. And it was like really getting to me. I was like, can you stop bragging? I told my mom and I was like, what do I do? How do I stop them from bragging? I remember my mom told me, just tell them, good for you. Like, I'm happy for you. Because like when you feed, like if they're bragging and then you're trying to like one up them, it just feeds their insecurity to one up you. I know that sounds obvious as a child. Like, oh yeah, that's so childish. But I feel like as adults, we can do that subconsciously or passively. We all know those people who like are giving you their LinkedIn achievements when you first meet them. And you're like, I didn't ask for your resume right now. I just want to know you as a person. And it's easy for us to like judge. But I think if anything, that kind of insecurity reveals that they have some wounds that they haven't known how to heal. And how can we love them and support them rather than being like, oh yeah, you did that? Well, I did this. And then trying to like fight this meaningless battle. So the last thing that we wanted to talk about, there's a lot more. And feel free again to drop in the comments if there are things that come up for you that you feel like comparison steals from you. But the last thing we want to talk about is very, very important. It is how comparison steals from us being able to live out God's purposes for us. And this is a huge one because when you think about it, it's not just about our happiness, our peace, our joy. Like those are all very important. But at the end of the day, comparison is literally the enemy's tactic to get you to be distracted and not do the thing that God has specifically made and called you to do. So one example, right, is if I'm so busy all day on social media or I don't know, just whatever, like thinking about how come I'm not like that? Oh, maybe I need to do this. Dang it. Like I'm so behind compared to other people. It's like so ineffective. It's like taking my focus away from being focused on what God wants me specifically to do. Nowadays, with like so many opportunities, we've talked about this in one of our previous episodes. Like there's so many side hustles, so many opportunities that you can go into now, and you're like, oh, everyone's doing this. Maybe I should do that. Oh, maybe So we're so busy. It's easy for us to chase potential of like all those opportunities. I don't want to get FOMO. I don't want to get left behind out of that fear and anxiety. Versus, okay, God, how can I focus? How can I really connect with you and listen to what you want me specifically to do, what you've assigned me, created me, purpose for me before I was even born? Like, what did you want me to do as part of your plans for your kingdom and for just my thriving, not being anxious or driven by fear, but being driven by purpose instead of potential. This is a very slippery slope, especially, and it can be disguised too. Like even in ministry, to be honest, I've seen this happen, and I've heard it happen a lot with pastors, not any specific one I'm thinking about, but I'm just in general, like in ministry, you can think of like, oh, how come my church isn't growing at the same rate as that other church? How come that pastor is so much better at preaching than me? How come they have better production and sound and music? And the list goes on. And you can kind of get in your head thinking about, oh man, maybe God is disappointed. Maybe like I'm doing something wrong. And then it's like literally the enemy's ploy to again distract you from the mission that God's called you to because you're so busy trying to be exactly like some other ministry or organization or leader.
Yeah, you can even apply this to the workplace or the company that you work for.
Yeah.
Here in the Bay Area, there's a lot of tech companies here, and it seems like a lot of people are vying to work at these places. Like I'll name a few, like Google, Apple, Meta, etc.
Like the Fang, or is it Mang now?
I don't know.
Mang,
I forget.
Meta, Apple,
Nvidia.
Oh, I thought it was Netflix.
Netflix.
Is it Nvidia?
Maybe it's up there. Anyways, any popular company out there, a lot of people want to work there. But then there's also other people who are in other companies too that aren't those companies. And it's easy to think, okay, if I work there, then I'll be happy or I'll be fulfilled. But that actually distracts you from where you are now. Only you can reach the coworkers that God has placed around you.
Yeah.
Basically, don't look after what other people are doing, but really just focus on, hey, this is where God has placed me. These are the people God has around me. I'm going to pray that God works in this way. I'm going to pray for God's favor. I'm going to pray for the Holy Spirit to fill me so I can be empowered to really live out the Great Commandment and the Great Commission where I am. So really, it's about owning your identity and your current situation and circumstance, and not looking to the left or to the right.
Right. Also knowing that your circumstances are not an indication of your worth, going back to the self-worth thing, because I think sometimes when we're comparing again, like, oh, that growth isn't happening, or I'm not as quote unquote well-known or impactful or influential or whatever, it's like, but maybe God actually wants to keep you quote unquote small or in the hidden season for a reason. There's so many characters in the Bible that don't even have names in the Bible, but they were like crucial to God's purposes. They were part of God's plans. We're so focused. It's so easy for us to be like, oh, I just want to be like King David. And I just want to be like, like Peter, who's like so famous. And again, not blaming social media, but I'm just saying like our technology has just exacerbated this problem of thinking that success looks a certain way when, I mean, God always knows what's best for us, but sometimes he knows that the small, hidden, not rapid growth is actually for our good because we're not ready yet. Or maybe, it's a piece of the puzzle that doesn't look a certain like way that we want for our own ego and our own pride. He actually wants to humble us and teach us and use us in a very specific way. I think for women, especially, this is ingrained in terms of our looks and appearances. I mean, men also struggle with this too, but I just feel like the beauty standards of the world, and especially, in high school, middle school, it's just very common, especially for girls to get like eating disorders or to think like, oh, my body needs to look a certain way or my face, and yeah, I just want to acknowledge that like there's so many ways that we can subconsciously compare. And again, if you have ever struggled with this, just know that it's not abnormal, that nothing is like quote unquote wrong with you. It's literally like so many people, everybody struggles to this to some degree in some certain way. And just to have compassion for yourself, being like, yeah, I was comparing myself and feeling like I wasn't pretty enough or attractive enough or whatever. And yeah, to really acknowledge that and bring that to God.
Yeah, I would say guys also struggle with that too. It's just less obvious, I would say. I mean, classic example.
Except at the gym when people are flexing.
That's exactly what I was going to say. They're at the gym, they're flexing, they're taking videos of themselves, whether it's to impress themselves in front of some hot lady that they found at the gym. There's a lot of ways, but yeah, I want to speak to the guys too, that I feel you. I know where you're coming from.
Yeah. And it's not just a middle school thing. It's like adults do this too.
Adults do that all the time.
Yeah.
And in very subtle ways.
Yes.
Those are just 3 of the effects that comparison can do to steal things from you. So we'd love to just transition to, how do you actually overcome this? How do you overcome this comparison? This poison of comparison? So there's a lot of ways, but we just want to share 3 ways that has worked well for us in just breaking free from the prison of comparison. The first one, it might sound simple, but it's profound. There's so many layers to it that we can go that we don't have time for. But the first one is to press into your identity as God's beloved child. Know that you're loved just the way that you are. God's given you specific talents. He's placed you wherever you are for a reason. You were born in the year that you were born for a reason, in the generation that you're in for a reason. You're in the season that you're in for a reason. And you're just loved by God. And God wants to partner with you to bring his love to the world. And when we just distract ourselves from that, it just, as Grace said, it takes you away from the purpose that God has given you. So,
and your worth in him that you already have versus like trying to get that from something, from your achievements or circumstances or whatever. But can you break down what it means? I think a lot of people will be listening to this and be like, yeah, I hear that all the time. Like, I'm God's child, but like, how do I really believe it?
Yeah. So in order to heal from something, you have to feel it. So this is where we'll get a little deeper. So I've been studying a little bit of neuroscience lately, and as a child from ages 0 to 12, those are your most formative years. So whether you've had trauma as a child, or your parents comparing you as a child, or whatever circumstance that you've had, from ages 0 to 12, you don't know much about the world, even if you think you do. Between those ages, you are forming your belief systems. You are going around the world, understanding what life is all about. You're collecting data, so to speak, on how to operate. And so you're creating your own belief systems in order to protect yourself from pain. And so as we grow older as adults, we subconsciously function as our inner child. believe it or not. So we are grown adults just living out our child. For example, for me, for a certain period of time, I couldn't see this particular person be successful, and it would trigger me. And he would hang out with our family as well, and my parents would praise him, and it triggered me a lot. So I honestly, when he would come over to our place, I would go into my room because I didn't want to witness my parents praising him instead of his own son.
Right.
And so
you didn't get praise, but then he's getting praised. So it's like making you feel, what was the lie or what was the story you were telling yourself as a kid when that happened?
I didn't believe my parents loved me. I didn't know God at that time, but at that time it was my parents. I didn't think that I had much worth at all. I didn't have much value because I couldn't excel in ABC. It felt like I just have no worth.
Right. So the story you were telling yourself was, I need to be like him with these traits to get praise from my parents in order to be loved and enough and worthy.
Yes. I vividly remember many experiences and memories of just that trauma that comes up, like short interactions with me and my dad about comparison. It's very subtle, but as a kid, you just internalize things and you live that out as an adult, which is why a lot of people struggle with comparison and many other things. So a practical tip actually is to reparent yourself. And we don't have enough time to go over this.
To be continued.
But you essentially need to reparent your inner child. And anyways, if you want to go deeper into this, I do have life coaching services that
just reach out.
That you can sign up for. And I would love to help you in this because it's honestly given me so much freedom in comparison and many other areas. But
feel free. The description will have the link to it. But Alex loves doing this stuff one-on-one with people. It would be a blessing to him if you reach out and you want to learn more about this. Because both of us are really passionate about like not just the behavioral modification of like, you can practice gratitude, you can do all this, you can memorize scripture, like all these things are really good, but we need to stop trying to solve internal struggles with only external solutions. It's definitely, a lot of it is also internal. And many of us are just never taught or equipped on how to do that. And so for both of us, and I think so many other people can attest to this, like the way to do that is with somebody who has already walked through that, has already experienced breakthrough, is able to help you along as well with that. To piggyback off of this point, in 1 John 4:19, one of our favorite verses is, we love because he first loved us. So if you think about it, like God first loved you, like before you ever could even love, before you even had the choice or even chose to love, before you were created and born, at the beginning of time when God created the world, like he already had you in mind. He already loved you. That's like mind blowing to think about, like, especially because as humans, we have a limited concept of time, but God is outside of time. Okay, now I'm getting into a wormhole where it's like mind blowing. So basically, if we don't firmly anchor ourselves in God's truth and really pursue, and it's not an easy overnight fix. You're not just going to suddenly snap your fingers and be like, okay, I get it. I know my identity. Like it's literally an ongoing process, but it takes that choice from your end, from that we've experienced too, us choosing to be like, hey, I need to go deeper in my understanding, not just knowledge-wise, but in my heart about my identity as God's child. Like, it's so worth it. So the more that you go deeper, the more that you really anchor and embrace this truth in your heart and soul, you will realize you're way less triggered by other people. You're not chasing for approval and trying to, prove yourself in all these ways to compensate for insecurity. The second tip that we have is related to this. It's actually also an internal thing that both of us have gotten a lot of help from and just grown from by using this tip. So it's to practice rejecting shame and self-condemnation and to instead accept Jesus's compassion for you. I know that's a mouthful, but basically to reject shame from the enemy and accept Jesus' love for you that he's already given to you. And the reason why we wanted to include this both is because it's not enough just to have one or the other. It's kind of like cleaning out like a dirty pool, right? Like if there's a lot of dirt in the pool, like, yeah, definitely you want to take out the dirt, but you also need to make sure you're filling that pool with clean water and from a reliable source too, not just like, bottled water and it's going to run out. And that's actually, why did I use bottled water? That's very exhausting. But yeah, you know what I mean? Like it's not enough just to have one or the other. You need to clean out and also fill in. So one of the things that we've talked about in episode, I think it was 7 with Bonnie, was about healing generational wounds and how big of a role shame has when it comes to our wounds and our pains and our triggers and our struggles, because shame keeps us trapped. It tells us like we shouldn't be feeling this way. Even if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, I have shame and I shouldn't feel shame. It's like it's a perpetual cycle of trapping you because you're condemning yourself. And that's the voice of the enemy. Like God never condemns us, only the enemy does. And so, especially in Romans 8, it tells us, therefore, there's no condemnation to those who belong in Jesus Christ. And that means if you've chosen to follow Jesus and you have put your faith in him, there's literally no condemnation. There's just pure freedom. There's joy. There's compassion. And so again, the antidote to shame is not to shame yourself and being like, I just need to force by willpower. I need to force myself to not feel shameful. Like that's just going to keep you trapped. The antidote really is to first off, break off any agreement with shame. We're learning that recently of like, you need to literally call out and reject, like say, I reject the spirit of shame. I break off any agreement that I have made subconsciously or consciously to shame myself, because if you have this agreement spiritually, like the enemy's using it as a tactic to keep you trapped. So after that, also making sure that you're inviting Jesus' compassion. What does that really look like, right?
What does it look like?
I
We hear this all the time,
right.
But what does that mean?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it has to do with the reparenting, of course. But just very simply, I would say how to start is just imagining like, how does Jesus see me right now? What does he think about me? Again, I think if you're so used to thinking about like scolding parents or people who look down on you and be like, oh, you should have done this and this. That's shame. That's condemnation. So really try to focus on, okay, Jesus loves me. Jesus is compassionate towards me. He sees me in my struggle and he doesn't shame me for it. So what would a Jesus who is full of love and compassion, how does he see me right now in my struggle? And so really it is like filling those holes inside of you with Jesus' compassion, imagining him with his arm right around you, like, hey, it's okay. Like you are enough. You're not defined by your circumstances. You don't need to have that job or that relationship or those things to be enough. Like I already love you. I love you exactly as you are right now, as I did before you ever did anything to even like earn you. Like you never had to earn my love, basically.
Yeah. One way that you can reparent yourself is, since we're talking about comparison, think about a memory that just was so vivid for you where you were compared to as a child. The earlier in your life, the better, because those are more formative. But really any memory will do. Take that memory, just close your eyes, imagine that memory, like really feel the emotions, even if it's hard and traumatizing. And in that memory, with your eyes still closed, invite Jesus into the room and ask Jesus, what would he say in this situation? Because
he was there with you in that situation.
Yeah, he was there with you, even
if
before even if you didn't know Jesus,
right?
He was there. God is everywhere, and he's beyond time. Right. And so that's one way that you can reparent, is to really understand truth, what Jesus would say in that situation, because parents are imperfect, right? No matter what. Even as great as they are, they're still imperfect people who have gaps. Only Jesus was the most perfect person. And yeah, just invite Jesus into that room.
Yeah, we talked about this in our episode. I forgot the number, but the one about our father relationships and how like our parents, they tried their best. And I'm sure when we become parents someday, we'll also be so flawed and mess up all the time. But God is the only perfect heavenly father with perfect love. And so it's so important for us. And I think one thing I wanted to add was Because I was just having this conversation with a friend the other day about how, it's scary to face your emotions, especially if they're uncomfortable. If you have been taught your whole life, like, don't be sad, don't cry, don't grieve, like, just move on, be strong. And when we've neglected ourselves our whole lives, like this, I can totally relate with this, because for a long time, for many, many years, my whole life, I was just focusing on helping other people. I was conditioned and taught, like, I'm the strong one. People are counting on me. Like, I'm the glue and everybody else is breaking down. So I have to keep going. But I feel like a core and key part of this is realizing you have needs too. You have pains. And if you're not addressing your emotions that are uncomfortable, it's going to keep festering and building up, and it's going to leak out in ways that you're like, well, why am I like self-destructive? Like, why do I get all these thoughts and I'm comparing? And it's just, again, going back to what Alex was saying, you have an inner child that's wounded, that is yearning for love and compassion, and your heart wants that from Jesus. We can go more into that in a future episode, but
Yeah, that's good. And the last tip we want to leave you is to identify and embrace your unique gifts. We've talked about this throughout this episode already, but really, if you don't know, well, first reflect and literally write down, what are you good at? What do you love to do? God's placed those things in your heart for a reason, and they're there for a purpose. So, for example, for me, I would compare myself and say, how come I don't have interests, talents, and passions that make a lot of money? It's kind of silly to say out loud.
A lot of people can relate to that, especially if like you're creative or not a STEM person.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I can do math. I excelled in math in school. I tried engineering, for example. That's what my parents wanted me to do. And I took some physics classes, advanced math classes, and I just thought, I could do this, and I probably could get into an engineering role if I really, really, really wanted to. But in my heart, I don't think this is for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's people who are more gifted, God's given gifts and talents to, and he wants to use them for his purposes, and they're there for a reason. So for me, I just pursued a career that's more in line with my abilities and my passions. I get to use my relationship building abilities with clients, working in tech, working in software. And so I feel like that's way more aligned to my abilities. But circling back, own your abilities and talents.
I think a nuance I want to add in, because as you're talking, I think a lot of people, and we've been through this ourselves, like, especially when you're like fresh out of college or you're like still young in your career, you're like, I have no idea. Am I good at this? Am I good at that? And people always say, go out of your comfort zone, try hard things, like stretch yourself. So I remember when I was like a fresh grad out of college, I would ask people, how do you know when to keep going in your strengths, but then also how to like balance that with trying new things that are outside your comfort zone that maybe you're not quote unquote good at, but you could become good at? Like, you know what I mean? There's like potential. Yep. And you're like, should I pursue that potential? I think for me, what I realized from so many years of testing different things out is it's not bad to experiment. Like we talked about this in our, I think, episode 3, like should you leave your job? Like, it's not bad to try different things and experiment and pursue opportunities and kind of test it out and be like, oh, maybe I am good at this. Maybe I am gifted. But I think what we have to be cautious about in that process is differentiating between, am I still doing this thing that I feel challenging because I want to try to force myself to become a certain way? Or do I really sense God's grace, God's spirit giving me that momentum growing in this, right? So I'll just share an example. I was sharing with Alex, like when I look back, I'm so grateful for all my experiences that I've had. But I remember as a recent grad from college, and I was like managing this team of like vendors and contractors. And, looking back, I'm very surprised that definitely God's grace was there. Like, people would tell me like, oh, you're doing a great job. You're a great leader. You're a great manager, whatever. But if I was honest with you, I was dying inside. Like, it was so hard. It was like I had to put all my energy, all my focus, and I was borderline burning out all the time, like not enough sleep or whatever. And it was just really, really hard. So if you're like if you feel like you're pushing a boulder up a hill, like it's just like, yeah, sure, maybe you're producing the external results that reflect a quote unquote good, outcome, or maybe like people are praising you, being like, oh yeah, you're really good at this, blah, blah, blah. But like, inside, this is really not my thing. It's not coming, not that it has to come easy, but it just doesn't feel like it's naturally outflowing from you. Then that's something to pay attention to, because you don't want to be stuck doing that when you're basically trying to write with if you're right-handed, write with your left hand, or vice versa if you're left-handed. But yeah, I think for me in this season, as we're working on the podcast, for example, I'm so encouraged when Alex is like, wow, like this is your thing. Like like it's definitely a lot of work that people don't see, but just the ways that my experiences, my gifts, my passions all combine, like even though it's hard work, it feels like an extension of the grace that God's put inside of me, of my gifts and my strengths and everything. And so, but I was only able, I think, to identify more of that after years of experimenting and doing things and pivoting. I think it's like Designing Your Life, that book I think I mentioned before. It's like iterating on your life. But if you don't iterate, if you're just like, let me just do this one thing and then don't iterate, then, you'll find yourself down the road many years later being like, this is not really, it doesn't feel like a fit for me.
Yeah, it's not everyone's meant to be an entrepreneur. Not everyone should have 5 side hustles or anything like that. I also think of businesses and companies. Not every company that starts needs to be a Google or a Meta. Every business is unique. Like, for example, I drink tea. So there's Starbucks available on every corner here in the Bay Area. But I like to go to the one that's a little bit more niche. That's not
like a mom and pop.
Like a mom and pop. And I like it because of the culture and the environment and the drink. That business has its own unique value proposition.
Right.
So for listeners out there, you have your own value proposition that you can offer to the world. And God just rejoices when he sees his child have fun and thrives in the gifts and talents that he's given them.
Yeah. And we read in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how we are a body, like we are different parts of the same body. And if everybody was the arm or everybody was the head, like that wouldn't make any sense.
Many people want to be the head.
Right. We would be a monster, literally like
a monster,
a million head monster. Yeah. So it's not about being the same body part as other people. Like the toe is just as important as the arm, as the nose, as the, I can go on. But I think when we remember, because society tells us to be individualistic, but if we remember the Bible, God's word tells us that we're meant to be interdependent as a body, united together. And one key part of being united, just going back to Alex's point earlier, is not comparing ourselves, not being competitive, being like, if they succeed, then I'm doing worse, because that divides us. And that ultimately also distracts us from our purpose, from being a body for God's mission. And it also makes us neglect the specific role that we have as that body part. So I think that's a really key verse. We'll link it in the Reflect and Apply guide. The other thing is we'll include some more context and background around how, because I'm sure people will be listening to this and be like, how do I identify my true gifts and strengths? And, that's a really good question and really important to really tap into. So we're going to include a lot more info on that in the Reflect and Apply guide. I know we went a lot of different directions with this conversation, but we hope that it was helpful to you. We hope that you could resonate a bit. This journey of overcoming comparison, it's never a complete journey. I think to some degree, every person is going to continue. At some point, it'll come up in little bits, just little increments. But the more that you practice overcoming it, the more you get better. When you see it happen, you can nip it in the bud and remind yourself like of the truth, instead of getting triggered and going down these spirals that are just, again, the enemy's way of distracting you from God's purposes. So it's an ongoing journey. Don't force yourself. Don't expect yourself to be perfect or to get it right away. Just with anything that we want to grow in our lives, it's all about embracing the process, not measuring ourselves by how quickly we can get to the outcome. It's really walking with God, letting him show you and transform you in your process, because that's the whole point, is he wants our connection, not our perfection. Just wanted to add that, to have grace for yourself because God has grace over you.
Yes. And I would love to help any of you who listen to this. And we have life coaching services as well. So we can dive deeper into whatever triggers that you have. We want to get to the root of your pain
Pull out the
and
weeds.
heal from that. Exactly. Pull out the weeds.
Can I add one more real comment right now?
Yeah.
As podcast hosts, we can even easily compare ourselves with other podcasts, just to be real. So I don't want you guys to think we're on this side, like preaching about, we're perfect. Like we're good. Like I honestly have to consciously, regularly, not to compare myself with other content creators or podcasters, because that's not the point. The point is everybody has a unique part of God's purposes and body. And the point is to obey him and not be quote unquote better than other people. I just felt compelled to mention that because I feel like the world continues to tell us, like, you have to be on top. You have to be better than so-and-so. You can't fall behind. This is how you beat out your competitors. And it's not bad to strive for growth and improvement. That's always good. But you should not be comparing yourself with other people. Compare yourself with your past self or your current self and ask God, like, how can I continue growing deeper in my worth and my contentment in you, and let everything else be an overflow of that. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that, because as podcast people, it can be very easy for us to get in our heads like, well, maybe like the lighting doesn't look good. Maybe the quality is not as good. Like, and for me, I'm like, oh my gosh, should I use like all these AI tools now when I don't know if we can, afford that right now? Regardless of where you're at, whatever you're struggling with in terms of comparison, just take notice of it and take inventory, and then bring it, just like Alex said, bring it to God and ask him, God, what do you think of me? Like, can you remind me right now how you see me, how you love me, so that I don't feel like I'm running this race that's not even the race I'm supposed to run in the first place. And that's also why it's so important to daily remind yourself, wash yourself with God's truth in God's word, because if you don't, it is so easy to just get overwhelmed with all these thoughts that are not from God. So yeah, we hope that this conversation spurs you to grow deeper in your faith and walk and step into God's freedom that he has for you. And just to end off, we do want to encourage you, if this episode helped you, to pass it on, to share with a friend. The only way that we really grow and continue to reach more people and help more people is when you, as the listener or viewer, share it with other people. So if you found this helpful, it would mean a lot to us if you did that on social media or just texting it to people. The other thing is, if you haven't already, please consider taking 30 seconds to leave an Apple podcast review, because it really, really helps. Kind of like leaving a Yelp review for a restaurant, a mom and pop shop, or whatever. It's like the more reviews we have, the more we're able to reach more people. So again, if you haven't done that, it really would mean a lot to us. And yeah, that's basically it. We'll see you guys next week for another episode.